Welcome back to Let's Talk Careers. My name is Miss V, and I am so excited to bring another incredible guest. Today, we are zooming out to the United Kingdom, where we meet Mark Saunders, a career practitioner and an employability advisor. Welcome, Mark. I'm so excited to have you with me today.
Hi, Maria. Likewise.
What an exciting title, Careers and Employability Advisor. I mean, all over the world right now, I'm sure there are people thinking, I don't know what a careers practitioner does, but employability must mean this guy's going to get me a job. If you could describe your role in a quick trailer version, how would you describe it, Mark?
Absolutely. And first of all, you posed a really important point there, because careers is quite a broad approach, in my opinion, to everything that life is about. So, people are their career identities are as unique as their fingerprints, I think, but maybe even more dynamic. So a lot of my role is around working with people who are unsure about the types of employment they'd like to go into and how their identity kind of fits in this really big nebulous world. Okay. And then the second part that you've mentioned is employability. And what I would say is, for me, that's almost the finishing part of a student's transition into work. So very technique-based in terms of techniques for CVs, cover letters, interviews. And I think I said careers was nebulous. I think employability is very focused, very sort of rigid, and very sort of technique-based.
I love that you've broken it down that way, because in a conversation I've recently had with aspiring career practitioners, the conversation of who decides what guidance should be about. And we looked at research, we looked at policies, and we were discussing career readiness. And I think it really is about, the aim for it is employability. Let's face it, we're having these conversations to make young people employable and make sure that they are career ready. So thank you. We could keep going into that conversation, but I know that our audience will be a mixture of practitioners, educators, and also young people and parents wanting to learn more about what you do, learn more through your journey. So I'm going to take you backwards in time, probably not too long ago, to when you were a teenager. And I'd like to talk about how you felt as a teenager. You described yourself as a young person that didn't really have academic interests, and you talked about your academic performance. And I think the story there is a really important one for young people, because you went on from being an academic person that you described as not really performing academically to then going to study law. So there's definitely a story on that journey. Take us back to that time and what it was like for you as a young teenager.
Absolutely. So I was sort of brought up and raised in what I'd call in the UK a council estate. And council estates differ, but I would say are typically more deprived than what I'd call private residential areas. My dad worked night shifts, so I didn't really get to see him a lot. And my mum sort of went from job to job in sort of cleaning-based jobs and stuff like that. And for me, I personally always felt a little disenfranchised from academics and learning. I felt like it was something I had to get through as a rite of passage, and then probably be like my dad or another family member and just work. And at no point did I ever consider that I had a say or any type of agency in what I wanted. And even if I did, all the way up to degree level, I can't say I truly believed in it. So for me, I left school with very little in terms of GCSEs at sort of 16 years old. And because I didn't really have any options, I decided to do GCSEs again at 18. And what was interesting, Maria, was I studied two subjects that I'd never covered before, so sociology and psychology. And in sociology, I read about inequalities and class systems, and just what became conscious for me is the same types of winners keep winning, and the same types of people that don't win. And it gave me some answers about maybe why I felt the way I did, and that I could have a say if I wanted to. So an area that was of interest to me also was law. My brother went to university a little bit before me, and looking back, he was probably a big influence on me. But the same thing happened, I think, Maria, in terms of I went to this place, this university, these big plate glass and steel buildings, almost cathedral-like. And I think it blinded me to what I actually wanted. So I did well on my law degree, but found it hard to get a job for around 18 months. And a lot of that was because I wasn't ready for work. And I don't think I knew what my identity was. So I think leaving university as a graduate, and that 18 months between finding my first job and then, was the first time I think I ever truly, really thought about myself and what I wanted.
That's incredible. There's so much depth to what you were just saying that I think young people feel, but don't have the words and often aren't feeling confident enough to have those conversations. You mentioned about the same people keep winning and the same people don't. And I think that for me is probably my number one purpose behind the work that I do. I believe that all young people deserve quality career guidance so that we can start to change that cycle of the same people keep winning. But taking the theoretical part of this conversation out and really diving in deep, for a young person or a parent watching this right now, what does that mean for them in terms of what you learned from your journey and what you do today?
I think what it means for a parent. So as I mentioned just before recording, I've got two children. One is 6 and one is 2, and I dread the day for when they become teenagers. But to facilitate and give the environment that children can say what they want and express how they feel, because I truly believe it's those environments and guidance that allow people to become themselves. So people's passions often bleed into the type of jobs that they really want to do, because most people want to self-express. So that's a big part. So for parents, you know, I would say don't necessarily go straight in with those rhetorical questions of what are you going to do or what do you want to do, and make it more of a conversation and a safe place, like an incubator to take risks. For children, I think it's the other side of the coin, really, and that it's okay to explore. And people say it's okay to make mistakes. And I do like that kind of mantra, but I would go further and say any actions in explorations aren't mistakes, they're stories. And let's use those stories and talk about them. So they're kind of the two areas in response to what you said.
That's amazing. Let's go back to doing GCSEs at 18 again. For a young person who is starting their GCSEs, or whether they're in a different curriculum around the age of 15 and 16 and going through those very important 2 years of their education in terms of academics, but also a very self-exploring time in their lives where they're expected to have answers that no one's really given them time to think about. What did you learn by doing it again at 18, 2 years older than your peers would have been when they had done them originally? What did you learn on that journey that could help a young person on their journey today?
I think exactly what you've just said in terms of those questions, and I mentioned them a second ago, just the defensiveness and negativity that those sort of predetermined questions cause. What do you want to be? And if we're truly honest with ourselves, even as, you know, two practitioners, there's still wiggle room in there for us to determine and evolve what we want. So going back to our 15 and 16-year-olds, I think it's about, you shouldn't have to do this, but trying to change the narrative. Maybe what am I now and what am I trying to work towards, rather than this is what I'm going to become. And personally, this is something I'm working on with my oldest daughter at the minute with homework. Practice really does make perfect. And every human being is gifted with intelligence. I think the thing that we're not all gifted with is the fortitude to keep trying. So when I did my GCSEs again at 18, what I learned, to answer your question, is that when something felt uncomfortable in terms of reading something new, to stick with it and to keep going over it until I got to a point where I had some kind of mastery. When I was younger, I just don't think I was strong enough. And that if I wasn't naturally gifted at something, I think I'd just leave it. So, you know, the answer is stick with it, have good conversations with your peers to hear how they're feeling. And I think you'll find some kind of collegiate in that as well, a collegiate in growth, let's call it.
Okay, let's go into your education. So you did your A-levels in law, psychology, and sociology. You then went on to do a Bachelor of Law. You followed it by doing a postgraduate diploma in career guidance.
Yeah.
Connect the dots for me.
Wow, that's such a big question, Maria. I think if that's such a really good question. The undertones of all of it, I think, is when I've learned something that I think has value, I've always wanted to share it. And if you were to ask me, what does value mean? It's normally to make things better for other people, or at least to give them the choice to say, here, use this. This might help you. So I found once I started learning sociology and psychology at A-level, I would almost find myself relaying and explaining what I'd learned, and people would find that really helpful. So that always gave me a good feeling inside that someone had benefited. And then I think with law, what I found with law was I loved the discourse, I loved the advice, I loved seeing a breakthrough with like a fictitious client, for example, but I disliked the ethics of charging people extortionate amounts of money. That there's sometimes a case in law is as successful as the money that you've got to throw behind it. And I think as I've got older, I've started to realise that I'm an advocate for social justice. So what I took from law was listening to people, facilitating conversations, adding value that I hope someone didn't have before. So when it came round to looking at a postgrad, careers, counselling and teaching were probably the areas that interested me most. And this is useful for, you know, any students and parents of students that are listening. A lot of people say they would like to help people. And normally we will end that conversation or leave that part and go, that's really good, great. So signaling some kind of virtue. My question is always, how would you like to help people? And that's normally the one that students say, well, that's a good question because I don't know. And I think that was a personal experience for me to figure out, and also a really good question for anyone who wants to go into a sphere of helping people.
Let's go and talk a little more about your role. You described your role as a careers and employability advisor in higher education, but you also said that your role is exclusively responsible for the delivery of IAG appointments. Information, advice, and guidance. The acronym is what IAG stands for. Sorry. Now, I'm struggling with that title. I have to be really honest with you, Mark. It was introduced to me last year, and I'm really struggling with it for two reasons. One, because being a career practitioner is still not regulated in the United Arab Emirates anyway. And I know in the United Kingdom, it's starting to become a little more defined. The benchmarks or the Gatsby benchmarks are giving it more attention. Inspectors are finally giving it that kind of attention it needs. School leaders are paying more attention to it, either because they want their funding or because they've really bought into careers. Traditionally, careers education was not even seen as a careers education. It was seen as careers equals higher education. Most often I'm told you should work at a university. They need a careers practitioner there. Secondary school, we don't really need that. So there's all that debate and discussion. And then comes in IAG. And I struggle with it because how do we give information, advice, and guidance if our career practitioners are not all qualified and trained to be reflexive learners as well, so that the information, advice, and guidance is not biased? How does that role land with you? I know that's a heavy one, but it's one that's important, especially in the United Arab Emirates, where IAG is being rolled out in secondary schooling. Because a young person coming to me is in a vulnerable position, and they will look to me as a role model, as they will their parents and influencers in their community. And when we give them information and we give them advice and we give them guidance, they're almost hanging on to it as hope. And how do we make sure as a practitioner that we're not being biased? And I know you can't speak for all practitioners, but how do you take that title and make sure that it is for equitable purposes, as you said, that you believe that this role should be about?
Again, a brilliant question and a really tricky one. So my personal, so just to almost go back to the beginning of what you mentioned, I feel from my experience in the UK, so around 10 to 12 years, careers is becoming professionalized. I think before that, it would sit with responsibility for teachers to fill some time. And that in the UK, that's called PSHE, pastoral studies, essentially. And I think it was an occupation was a nice occupation for people to go to from other types of jobs. I think it's becoming professionalized because of the use of theory. And I think that's really useful in giving us some kind of impartiality. I also think there's a lot of evidence to say that education is one of the levers for equality. So to give careers an educational footing with lecturers and teachers, I hope in theory shortens that gap. My issue, Maria, and it's not all good news, is I don't think that careers are impartial, because there's always a metric that will determine funding, even for private practitioners as well. So you said right at the start that employment is one of the big things. So for me, that erodes a little bit of our impartiality. So in higher education in the UK, there is a big, big expectation that graduates will leave and find graduate level employment. And I think that straight away challenges this aspect of impartiality. So for me, I personally think the profession needs to carry on promoting the fact that it is a safer place for a conversation, a more impartial place than anywhere else you will find in a school, in a college or a university, to talk about what you want to talk about. My concern is that employability narrows the conversation too early. So I worked with a student a few years ago who told me she didn't know what she wanted to do and as a future job. And we just spoke about her interests and her passions, and she described being a birthing partner twice for two of her friends. And she described how that made her feel and the type of help that she did and the insights that she got. 5 years down the line, she is a midwife. I wanted to say maternity, a midwife. And that was all based on an open, nebulous conversation about what do you do? What have you done? What do you care about? I feel like employability is a really useful tool, but I feel like it's limiting those conversations too early. Does that make sense? It does.
It does. And it reminds me that career practitioners and the work that we do is very subjective work, and every student has a different context. And what I'm taking away from what you're saying is we really need to think about that student in front of us, the context of that young person, and help them. And there will be limitations. And I think in every profession, there is bias, there is privilege, and it's about being able to unwrap it. When we look at your top 3 tips, you say that we should think about some hard questions. One of them is explore. Number 2 is be willing to get things wrong, because they usually end up being right. And number 3 is treat development as a lifelong process. I love all 3. I think I can definitely resonate with all 3. But for a parent listening to this right now, talk to them through those 3 perspectives and tell us really in more depth what you mean by explore, be willing to get things wrong, especially for a parent who might be footing the bill to university and higher education. And they're like, what do you mean be willing to get it wrong, Mark? I can't afford for them to get it wrong. They need to get it right. And then treat development as a lifelong process.
So I think the first 2, for sure, exploration and be willing to get things wrong, kind of they all gravitate together, but those 2 are a bit like spaghetti and bolognese for me, because they're just so close and interlocked. And I think what I would say to parents, and something that I'm learning myself, is going back to this idea of having open conversations, we need to listen and respond proportionately. So what I would say to any student out there is the things that give you energy and make you feel good about yourself could be harnessed and used in employment for something that you do, for a large part of your life. And for me, that sounds really exciting, that there's that opportunity to do that. Now, going back to parents, if we listen, I think we can judge how much we need to invest at a particular time. Okay, so my parents were quite knee-jerk, so it was either nothing or everything. And when we're talking about time and costs, start with the conversation and just invest in proportion. So what I say to students in higher education is, rather than investing 6 months into work experience on something you might like, start with exposure rather than experience. So go into that environment to see what it looks like. Talk to professionals before investing hundreds of pounds and weeks on end of something where your child might say, do you know what? I hated every minute of that. And I just didn't have the courage to tell you. So for me, being willing to get it wrong, because you often get it right, is if you get exposure to something like I did with law, you don't like it, there's still some good in that. There's still some value to take. It helped me refine what helping looks like. So rather than get a job in the legal profession or to invest a long period of time, my exposure was an hour in a law firm. That's all I needed. But if I liked it, then we should just step it up step by step. And I think that's where the careers practitioner can help with parents and children. So I don't know about your own practice, Maria, but I encourage parents to come in with students to talk about career plans together. And then in terms of this idea of development being a lifelong process, I think, again, we're swimming against the tide, because I can only talk from my experiences in the UK. Everything is always about getting something and then moving on to the next level. And what I try and advocate in students is to stop and look around, to try and pick the good in what you're doing and get the most out of it. Because I think that has such a big multiplier effect for the future. And I just think sometimes with curriculum, we can get lost in that. And like you mentioned earlier, where parents' concern and love can almost be misrepresented as pressure of what you're going to do next. No parent asks that because they don't care. Because they care that they ask, but it's the wrong question.
And I resonate with what you're saying, and I do feel for parents. And again, I think that going back to the career journey and that decision-making process, it is very subjective. It's different, and it looks different depending on social class, depending on education, depending on parental support and their own education, depending on the journey of influencers, and I think sometimes the influencers, when they're giving their advice or they're giving their guidance, very often they're giving it based on a perspective of what they wish they had done. And this is why when I asked you about IAG, my concern is, are we really reflexive when we're giving that? Are we considering the perspective and the lens? And I think for parents, it's a very vulnerable time, because honestly, Mark, I know we're getting into a deeper discussion here, but parents are making assumptions that secondary schooling has had these conversations with their children. And so rightly so, they should be making those assumptions. But at the same time, secondary schools may or may not be having these conversations. You talked about PSHE, and for anyone watching this, can you break down that for me? Is it physical, social, health, and education, isn't it, that PSHE? And so careers is kind of thrown into that. Where does it fit? Depends on the curriculum. There's so many misconceptions and assumptions made along the way, and the young person is expected to have answers. And it's not just their parents. I think it's also when you speak with a young person getting closer to graduating from either sixth form or high school, whichever curriculum they're in, it's also teachers, it's also school leaders, it's also peers. And then there's the university advisor that kind of says, come on, you got to get that personal statement or that college essay. Where are you going to go? What are you going to do? And of course, in the UK, students will have opportunities for apprenticeships, and some might even go straight to work. In the United Arab Emirates, the idea of an apprenticeship is still something new. It's coming together, and it's not readily available for all students. Apprenticeships is something that we're starting to learn more about. And then there's going to work for a young person in the UAE. If they're not a national student, that means they have to leave their family and go back to their home country and find a job. Who prepared them for that? So I feel for parents. I'm going to stop talking and rambling about that, but definitely a deeper conversation to be having. Mark, going back to your own personal journey, as you look back, being a practitioner, helping young people, being able to see the transferable skills from being a university student yourself who studied law, what are the learnings that you think, if anyone remembers anything right now, if you're a parent helping your child, if you're a leader helping your career practitioner, if you're a practitioner helping a young person, if you remember anything from my conversation with Mark today, what do you want them to remember that will help a young person tomorrow?
The best advice I can give is anti-advice, actually. It's to go and have a guidance conversation. And there's a lot of evidence and research to suggest that as people talk, they resequence things in their mind, they make sense of it. And going back a little bit to what you said, there are outcomes and there are expectations. And the easiest way from a bird's eye view is to tell someone what to do, because the hope is you'll move as many people from A to B quickly. But guidance is something that I think that system sees as inefficient. Everybody has career, and not everybody has employability or employment. Okay, so there is always a good open conversation to have about careers, and it creates opportunities.
Thank you, Mark. Thank you, thank you, thank you. It has been such a pleasure having you with me today. We dove into several parts of your career journey, being a younger student, and also some tips for practitioners and parents. Thank you for being with me today and for sharing your insights and for being really honest about what it was like for you when you were a young student. I think that's something that I'm going to really remember the next time I work with a young person is you don't need to get it at 16. Maybe you get it at 18. Maybe you get it at 25. Maybe you get it at 45. I think the journey is lifelong, as you said. So thank you for being here with me today, Mark.
My pleasure. Thank you.
And that brings us right to the end of another incredible career conversation. Today, we were speaking with Mark Saunders, who was talking to us about his career insights as a careers and employability advisor, but he was also talking to us about his own personal career journey. I will see you all at our next Let's Talk Careers with Miss B.